although there are polls and although I'll be calling on people to share their insights, there is no exact one right answer. So you shouldn't go into this process with any sense of trepidation or fear about getting things wrong. It's really about exploring how the mind works. And by understanding how the mind works, we gain some power in treating each other fairly and in watching out for each other when the inevitable problems of bias pop up. Okay. And I understand my parent panelists are Johannes, Jean, Adeline, Sawatu, and Xavier. Is that right? All right, perfect. Okay, so again, who am I? My name is Camille Rich. I'm the principal of Rich Diversity Consulting. You may have seen me on CNN when I came on to talk about Rachel Dolezal, very controversial figure. My area of specialty is racial identity development, and so I've grown increasingly interested in how children come to acquire their understandings of race, how they play those definitions out, and what role we as parents play in that process. I am the parent of a daughter at an independent school. She goes to Polytechnic, where I also do some consulting work on racial identity development. And in my spare time, I'm a law professor, and I've taught at Yale, Stanford, and I'm currently at USC. Okay, so our topic for tonight, right? What is implicit bias? It's really just a fancy way of saying those patterns or associations we tend to make in snap judgments that tend to favor a particular group. And so if we're concerned about these snap judgments that we make that tend to prefer particular groups, we want to be really aware, right, of when they're happening. That's the first step, is awareness. There are going to be things where you just make a decision in the blink of an eye, okay? And that is a moment where stereotypes can be activated. Over time, what happens is because of implicit bias, you find yourself giving favors to people from your preferred group. So who do you let walk first, right, when there's space on the sidewalk? Who do you offer the second interview to, the callback interview to, when you're making a snap decision? Those are the spaces in which implicit bias manifests and appears. But you can see that there's a huge difference between who you let walk in that space on the street versus who you give the second interview to. And some of those decisions around who you give the second interview to or who you give the benefit of the doubt, right, end up creating these patterns of structural inequality. So on the surface, the world looks like everybody's getting the same opportunities and the same benefits. But when we have these little teeny tiny moments where we make fast decisions, there's a way in which the world around us causes us to give preferences to particular groups. We'll talk about how those preferences get embedded. We'll talk about how you can resist those preferences. And we should also talk about the emotions people have around recognizing that they have these preferences, because I think for a lot of people, there's a feeling of guilt or anxiety about this. Rather than just accepting it's how the mind works, and we need to figure out how to outsmart the sort of lizard parts of our brain that make these quick assumptions. If you can get past the emotional block of blaming oneself for this happening, you're much better at disrupting it. So people who sort of prefer to say, I'm innocent, I never do this, this doesn't happen to me, actually end up causing real dangers because they refuse to monitor themselves. And so the implicit bias can just play out in their behavior and they never try to control it. So it's really important to think about the emotional piece as well. Okay, so in thinking about implicit bias, I like to think about my relationship to my GPS. I can do this in LA because most people are sort of forced to be drivers at some point in time. And many of us have had to drive places where we don't quite know exactly where we're going. But there are also plenty of places where you know exactly where you're going. And sometimes, and I hope I'm not alone in this, but sometimes I sort of look up and I'm back at my house and I don't remember parts of the journey. Okay, that's your autopilot. It remembers how things work. It remembers where you're supposed to stop at that corner. It remembers the stoplight. It remembers the stop sign. It even remembers the pothole in the road that you drive around and so you don't hit it. You don't remember all of these things. They are now embedded in your brain, and you make decisions based on those pieces of information you stored a long time ago. You typically don't reassess them or think about them very much. They just occupy your mind and they work for you, and they actually, for the most part, keep you safe. But there have been times when you get in your car and you turn on the GPS and it suggests another way home. Do you listen to the GPS or do you go with your own GPS, which has served you time and time again? So for some people, they're willing to take the gamble and they follow the GPS the car offers them. And then they're filled with frustration when it takes them down some back alley or some road that they know is not the best way to go. And they say, why did I depart from my, automatic assumptions about what I should do? And for other people, they discover, wow, I saved 5 minutes on my trip or 10 minutes on my trip. And so now they're ready to do things a little bit differently. That's what's happening with your mind and implicit bias, is you're using experiences you've had with particular groups or messages society has given you about particular groups. And sometimes that information has worked well for you, and sometimes it hasn't. And it's all about your response to those moments where the patterns are disrupted, where you get new information, and whether or not you course correct. But if you can remember that relationship to the GPS and sometimes the irritation when it suggests to you a different way of doing things, that's often what happens to people when they are presented with information that doesn't match up with what their racial GPS is telling them about the world. Okay, a good example to take this GPS analogy right to the street, right, is how do you walk down the street and judge where there is danger? When there's a person who maybe I do know that person. Their face looks similar to someone that I know. Your mind is always categorizing, cataloging information, and making judgments. Some of those judgments are going to be based in stereotype. It is very difficult to grow up in any society and not get caught up in the cultural web of stereotypes that are constantly in circulation. So the next time that you're walking down the street, I invite you, right, if you can stop thinking about COVID for 2 seconds, which is really difficult when you're on the streets today, right? But to think about what your GPS is doing. What is it telling you? Is it telling you to move closer to someone, further away? All of that, right, is the implicit bias working in your brain. Okay, so the best way to see this is to see it in terms of an example, something that could happen to you. So I'm going to invite you to pretend to be the guy here with the clown nose, okay, at a birthday party. So your 6-year-old daughter, Agatha, is having a birthday party, and you find her crying in the bathroom because she discovers that the sugar cookies that her grandfather baked for her have gone missing. Now, Agatha admits to you that she showed the fancy cookies to 3 friends, and all of the kids said they looked super delicious. You question the group of children she spoke to about the missing cookies, and all 3 of them look at each other and giggle hysterically. You must determine which child's parent you will ask about the cookies. Each child has brought a knapsack to the party, so they have their little backpacks with them, and you're pretty sure that if you just look in the knapsacks, you will find the cookies, and Agatha will once again be able to enjoy the party. And for those of you who still have, pretty young children, you know what it's like when a child is inconsolable and there's kind of a sense of urgency that grips you. Okay, so I want you to be in that moment where the child is crying, it's the birthday party, you've spent, a week or 2 planning this thing, there's 30 kids running around the house, okay? You've got to make a decision. All right, this is the moment, you've got to make a decision. If she gets those cookies back, party's great. If she doesn't get those cookies back, you can just imagine. Who took the cookies? We have 3 candidates. These are the 3 kids she told about the cookies. First, we have Julian. Now, Julian's mother is a vegan. She went on a rant at last year's event about the evils of sugar. You have seen Julian looking longingly at the cake. And when you offered a slice to him, he looked at it, and then he looked at his mother nervously and said, no. Okay, he's the first child she told. The second one is Daquan. Now, you've never met Daquan's father, but his mother always appears to be overworked and rushed. She never has time for a conversation. Daquan told Agatha that his mom has never baked cookies for him, and he doesn't know his grandparents. And you also know he was suspended last year. Okay. And then you have Min. Now, Min is from a proud Korean family. She often brings delicious Haijuan and daesik to school, and she asked Agatha whether her cookies are similar to these items. Now, Agatha said she did not know, and Min's mother and father are both engineers. You've met them, and she enjoys Kumon a great deal. Okay, so Stephanie, can you put up our poll for us? Remember, your darling little girl is in distress. She is about to pop. You've got a bunch of kids running around the house. She wants those cookies. You have got to figure out which parent you are going to ask about these cookies. You've got to get those cookies back. Your daughter is in distress. Okay? Who took the cookies? I know I have been in this situation. My daughter had a unicorn butterfly princess birthday party last year. That was actually the theme. And I wore a unicorn horn throughout the party, as well as a pair of fairy boots. And she got very upset at one point, and so it was the sort of basis for this, this example. But we've all been there, right, in the middle of these huge kid events, lots of kids running around. Suddenly a kid gets distressed, and you just have to figure things out. So we have half of our votes in. If we can get the rest of those 40 folks to weigh in, I promise you this exercise is much more fun if you make a decision. And I promise you that they're all about exploring how the brain works. And there are no quote unquote wrong answers. Okay. Okay, I'll give it about 10 or so more seconds. And we're going to have a lot of time to talk about the reasons that you made one choice or another, and explore their implications, explore how understanding all of this will bring us closer as a community. So far, Julian's looking bad. Things are looking bad for Julian. If I can lure those last 20 or 30 or so people out into a vote, I promise you that this experience is a lot more fulfilling if you've actually made a decision. And if you were at the birthday party, you would have to, right? Your daughter's right there. She needs your help. I got one more, okay, almost there. And if you're resisting making a decision, I want you to sort of explore why. That also can be part of our conversation. Explore why. I see some folks have their kids there too. They may want to vote. I can't take 2 votes from a household, but they can register their vote with you. Who took the cookies? I'm not going to get those last 20 or so people to vote.
Sorry, Camille, how do you vote?
Oh, there should have been a poll that popped up on your screen, and then a choice for Julian, for Daquan, and for Min.
We have the photos.
We have only your deck, but now.
Oh, how interesting. Stephanie, do you know?
No, it's the first time I'm doing that, but maybe your Zoom version
Oh,
is
blocker. Oh.
Oh, okay. Oh, so that may be what's happening. So for the 20 or so people that haven't voted, I'm going to assume that maybe it's a Zoom update that you didn't get the poll.
And I couldn't vote because I'm the host with you, for example.
Okay, so that's 2. So well, 75% response.
Well, you put it on there.
That's pretty good. Okay, and I mean, I
Sorry,
think, yes?
Sorry, I vote in the chat.
Okay. So why don't you, Xavier, why don't you share your vote with us? Who did you vote for? Who took the cookies?
I will say Julian because he wants to know what sugar feels.
Okay, so you thought that his, he stared longingly at the cake. You said he wants to know what sugar tastes like?
Yes, because he never get the taste, so he's interested and curious.
Okay, right. And so how can you tell that he's never gotten a chance to taste sugar?
Because he's nervous when the mother said no about it, and the fact that the cookies probably are not vegan, so mother do not allow to get like cakes that are not like labeled, not vegan.
Okay, so you know a little something about vegans, right? You know that sugar's not a big part of the diet. You know that Julian's looking right nervously at the cake. Okay, so you've got some evidence there that he's motivated. This kid's motivated to get access to sugar. He saw those sugar cookies and it was just too much to resist. He's just a kid, right? So he's a very good candidate. Now, some folks said men.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who chose men, would you like to? Did anybody on our panel choose men? Or really anyone can volunteer.
I chose men. Well, I actually did multiple because in my perspective, it could be any three of them. Like based upon those criteria that you've given, there's no way to know. I mean, kids are kids. So it could be Julian. I mean, kids are like, you know, what kid wouldn't take a cookie if they got the opportunity was my perspective.
Okay, and why would you say what kid wouldn't take a cookie? Where is that coming from?
Meaning from, I mean, I tend to be a person that likes cookies. I like sweets. My daughter likes cookies, likes sweets. So if I were to leave a cookie where she could take it, she most certainly would take it.
Okay, so
she'd hide it somewhere.
Right, this is what I mentioned. Like kids are gonna be kids. They see a cookie, they're gonna take a cookie. Based on your personal experience of your love of cookies, I know not to leave cookies around you. I'm just kidding. And right, and your experience with your daughter, okay? So these are the kinds of things that you're going to use your own understandings, your stories, to give you some context for how to judge all this information. And you said it could be any of them, right? How do we know it's not all of them, frankly? Maybe they got together and took the cookies. Someone who said Daquan. So again, Johanna said it's possible that I gave you something in each description that gave you enough of a basis to say maybe this person took the cookies. This is a session on racial implicit bias, so I figured everyone was going to run from Daquan.
I mean, if you're looking for me to answer, like I said, as a Black person looking at Daquan, it's like I've seen those stereotypes, and those stereotypes have nothing to do whether someone's going to take a cookie or not. I mean, I've seen the other side where because of those factors, someone will assume he took the cookie. But like I said, from my perspective and being Black, these are a lot of factors that they mean nothing to me. And that's why at the end of the day, I was like, it could be all three of them.
Okay, and so what are the stereotypes about Daquan? And again, I'm not putting you on the spot. It could be anyone can answer this question. What stereotypes that seem to be activated by Daquan's story?
Because basically, when I look at it, he's poor, he's a troublemaker, and these things basically, i.e., make him a thief.
Okay, and how
likely? And I say likely to take things that are not his.
Okay, and so can we talk a little bit more about how we know that he's poor?
I mean, I'm reading between the lines, but the mother's overworked. So I'm reading assumptions into what's in front of me.
Okay, which is what people do with that kind of information. I thought I heard another voice.
Oh. No, I was just saying that, yeah, the mother could be an overworked entrepreneur
or lawyer.
Or a lawyer, like yourself.
Okay.
I didn't choose him, and the reason why I chose the person I chose is because I thought that the parent might be a little bit more approachable, and maybe the mom was, busy and I chose it based on the parents, actually, not the child and the approachability of the parents.
Okay, so in your mind, it was more a question of which parent you could potentially work with, or who was going to be more constructive, and you talking about the cookies. So who did you choose?
Yeah, I listened to the stories mostly from the perspective of the parents, and who I could say, hey, do you happen to know what happened to the cookies, as opposed to, I looked at it from the perspective of trying to talk to the parents, not about something inherent in the child. I don't know if that was the wrong thing to do.
Well, I think it's something that parents do sometimes. Do you approach the child with the parent who you think is going to be difficult, or do you approach the child with a parent who maybe you have some relationship with, some affinity to, some point of connection, or you've seen them react to these circumstances before and you kind of know what you're going to get? So who did you choose?
Chose the young man that everybody else chose.
Julian. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And why do you think, now his mother has gone on a rant at the school in the prior year about the evils of sugar.
Right. The reason why I chose her is because I feel like I could just simply ask her and she probably would just give me a straight up answer like, no, he did it, or no, he didn't. And then I would move on to the next parent if I really had to figure out something, you know?
Okay, so that's interesting because there is some contrary information in the description itself, but I'm wondering if there's something around, you know, her being so health conscious, something makes you think that you can approach her. Maybe she's similar to parents you have interacted with in the past, and so you have some confidence.
I think it might be that, and just I feel like I'm always looked at as somebody who is not approachable when you first know or hear about them. So maybe that's a kinship that I feel, some type of affinity. And so I just thought, hey, you know, I'd probably ask her first. I don't know.
Okay.
It was also the first choice.
It was the first choice, meaning across the rows, which order they were in?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone want to weigh in on the choice of Min?
Hi.
Hi.
My son actually is here with me, and so I presented this slide to him and asked him what he thought, and I was wondering if he could share his opinion.
Sure.
I think the girl and the boy next to the girl stole the cookie, because the girl, it looks like she has little toppings, and the boy isn't showing his hands. So I think they stole the cookie.
Well, thank you for that. So she is next to those little toppings, those sugar toppings, and he is not showing his hands.
So I think the boy was holding the cookie while the girl was getting nice toppings for the cookie.
Well, makes total sense. I think you're on your way to being a detective. I don't know that any of our parents actually noticed the physical placement of the hands, but these are things people pay attention to. Expressions, hand placement. For some people, right, the expressions on the kids' faces are telling. So we did a different version of it. Anybody think the expressions the kids' faces are helpful in some regard?
Yeah, so we picked Julian, and I think that his facial expression was definitely weighing into that because he kind of looks a bit smug and entitled.
Okay, the finger on who does that, right? The finger on the face in that way. It's even a joke in the Austin Powers movie where the sort of villain puts his finger on his face in that way. It's, you know, what background are you using to sort of assess whether or not someone looks suspicious? Does Daquan look suspicious or sad, or anything about him that makes him look like maybe he's guilty?
Not to me.
Okay.
Maybe the hands.
I know now I'm looking at everybody's hands. I wasn't looking at
all the hands.
I think in looking at all these, it seems like they're biased with each one of these choices. And I picked Julian, and I wonder sometimes, or in thinking about it after, if part of it is a bias against stereotypes about vegans.
Okay, I think there are a lot of people out there who have strong feelings about vegans, or they think they know a lot about vegans and about vegan food. For some people, it's associated with intolerance, kind of stridency, a strong perspective. So to what extent does that play into people's understanding? How's that different from race? Okay, I'm posing the questions to you, not expecting you to answer them, but trying to trigger you to think about their relationship to one another. No one is talking about Min, yet a good number of you chose her. What's Huaijian? What's Daisik? Anyone? Okay. Is someone about to weigh in?
Yeah, I voted for Min because she's inquisitive and she wanted to see if the cookies were similar to what she has at home. And kids are always inquisitive, and she therefore decided just to satisfy her curiosity.
Okay, great. All right. So that was the sort of trigger for the suspicion possibly of Min. I included these Korean desserts because I thought that maybe some portion of the community would know what they were. And my question for you is, having that information helpful in figuring out whether she took the cookies or in not taking the cookies? So they happen to be very sweet desserts. Okay, but in the place of having the actual information is, what did you do in terms of assessing her likelihood of having engaged in this behavior? Did anybody try to look them up or figure out what they were?
No, I made a decision without knowing what they were at all.
Okay, right. Another opportunity for you to think about how bias can operate in this space is how often do you act on things with incomplete information or not knowing anything about the thing that's presented to you and making judgments?
Well, it seems like the stereotype about Asians is smart, responsible. So maybe there's some decisions just automatically ruling her out because of that.
Okay, another opportunity for you to reflect on that. So I didn't do anything to disrupt some of those stereotypes in the air. I wanted you to notice them, right? The stereotype of the model minority, hardworking, right? I said her parents are engineers. I didn't say what kinds of engineers. I didn't say whether they were attentive or not. I mentioned that she goes to this after-school program. For people who don't know what Kumon is, right? It's an after-school study program.
Could I ask a question? Because it occurs to me that like a lot of the way bias acts is in unconscious ways, and this feels like a very conscious exercise. Like we're spending a lot of time agonizing and thinking through sort of, who we'd make the choice about and why, and that's not really how things happen at a real party in the real moment. So I'm just I'm trying to reconcile this exercise for me with like helping us process how unconscious bias works, because it works very differently, I think, than what we're doing right now. What we're doing right now is consciously avoiding saying or thinking anything racist about Daquan, right? Because it's a workshop on unconscious bias. And like really consciously naming things that might or might not enter our consciousness when we're making a quick decision in front of people in the moment, and we're stressed parents running a birthday party and the dessert went missing and our kid's upset, right? Like that's when it kicks in more, I think.
Absolutely. So here's why the exercise works. It's because all of you, right, are conscious and aware of the stereotypes that you think I'm trying to mobilize about Daquan, which shows that you're aware of them, which shows that they are at least part of your mental calculus. And that is an important thing to establish in this exercise. As I said from the start, I knew people were going to run from Daquan. But in running from Daquan, right, you were forced to contend with some of the stereotypes in society about who Daquan is and precisely how they get activated. I never said this kid is poor. He's actually pretty well dressed. He says he's never met his father, but that doesn't mean anything. His mother appears overworked. Someone mentioned that she could be an entrepreneur. And if she's an overworked entrepreneur, she probably doesn't have time to bake cookies. I'm actually struggling with the fact that I didn't help my daughter make an apple strudel this afternoon, right? So, because she had to make one for Girl Scouts. But the point is, right, that I wanted you to be aware of the ways in which we kind of try to disavow stereotypes, even as we know that they are operating in society. I also pointed out that he was suspended last year because you don't just encounter children as a blank slate. You know things about their parents. You know things about their histories. You're part of a community. So even when you go into that birthday party and think you're making a snap decision, what you're actually doing is what you're doing right now. I've just slowed the process down to a crawl. So your brain is doing the exact same thing we're doing now, but just doing it at lightning speed. It's picking up on these facts and it's organizing them and it's categorizing them and it's understanding who you're going to act on And all I've done is drag you through that process at an excruciating slow level for some of you. But for others, right, it makes it clear the ways in which we are using information and linking it up with stereotypes that we've learned from other places, some of which we can't even remember, and then using that to guide our behavior. A little more about how the brain works. So for those of you who, again, were brave enough to sort of stride out there and make a choice, these are the heuristic tools that your brain used to organize that information. We're not even at the point of stereotypes yet. In the previous version of this exercise, all we talked about was Julian. So there was a longer description, but I invited people to figure out which one of these caused them to make the determination that it was him. Okay, anchoring bias, the first piece of information. So for some people, they overweighed, right, the first piece of information they heard about each person or each child. How often does that happen to you when you're learning about children in a much more natural and organic process? If you heard that Daquan was suspended at some point, and you don't even know that that's true, that would continue to shape your interaction with him, even if you learned other information later on, okay? Confirmation bias is you might start to filter out other information about Daquan because you know he was suspended, so you would start to filter out contrary information. You would be looking more for more evidence to justify the suspension. That's confirmation bias. Bandwagon effect. For those 20 or so people that didn't vote, and they noticed a lot of people chose Julian, maybe Julian started to look a little bit more interesting. And they started to look at that description a little bit more closely and scrutinize it a little bit more. Those vegans are kind of suspicious, aren't they? They're kind of strident. That poor kid has never had any sugar. I've had some bad interactions with vegans. Goes on and on and on. Okay, that's the bandwagon effect. Failing to recognize your own bias is a bias in and of itself. So for those people who are like, I would never have accused Daquan of this, and I would never give into those stereotypes about that particular group of people, you're going to run into bias problems because you're not willing to engage with the fact that this is what's happening right all around you. That your mind is trying to pick up things in order to shortcut its way through information and make decisions in situations where you don't have precise or accurate information often. So Michael, I think we're going to share these slides. Is that right? Well, we probably will, but you will get a chance, okay, to look at all of the different bias.
Yes, we will be sharing this information.
Okay, great.
We're recording and we'll be sharing.
Great. So you'll get a chance, right, to go back and think about the ways in which different tools, different shortcuts were used in your thinking as you worked through the different examples to try to figure out which one sort of pushed you over into making a decision in favor of one child or another in this particular example. Some people try to see patterns in random events. Our mind tries to make sense of information that way. So the narrative about Julian's mother's rants, right, combined with his sort of nervously looking at the cake. He might have just been nervously looking at the cake, hoping that his mother would give him a slice this time. She might be one of those vegans in public, but in private, right, she gives her kid sugar all the time. And so he's like, is mom gonna give it to me this time? Is she not? So he's nervous. Okay, but you end up creating a smooth narrative, right? And you noticed our younger participant constructed a very nice narrative for us in terms of making sense of all of the events, the hidden hands. He had a whole story about how Min and Daquan worked together. Now, I don't think Julian was involved in that story, but you could easily see how he would have been, is he was able to construct a narrative that linked them together.
Camille, Miss Camille, excuse me.
Sure.
I have a quick question for you. This is all very interesting, but one thought came to mind for me and I wanted to get your perspective. What if what if I chose to speak to all three parents? Am I avoiding, or is that just another way of dealing that is reverse bias? What does that mean, if anything?
So I'm very sneaky. That's part of the presentation. You just give me a couple more slides. We're going to get there.
No problem.
Okay. Not exactly your question, but pretty close to it. Okay, so quickly through, right, consciously, we're processing about 40 pieces of information per second, unconsciously 11 million. The brain is a powerful thing, but it is going to try to make shortcuts when it can, because there are so many decisions that we have to make, and often many of them are right just below the radar screen we're not fully aware of what we're doing. Okay. The takeaway is implicit bias affects a lot of groups. We talked about some of the bias that may be lodged against vegans, but it's fundamentally different, right, from the kinds of bias that's lodged against particular racial groups. Those are more sedimented and more embedded. We can see they have larger structural effects in terms of economic inequality. And so we have a responsibility to work against them. And you saw, I again tried to trigger you for certain stereotypes, but these pictures are meant to illustrate the ways in which, right, people feel like these stereotypes are kind of mapped over or tattooed over their bodies as they move through space. And they're always wondering if something they're going to do, which could be read against a completely different backdrop, will instead be read against this, right, cloud of stereotypes that surround them and make it very difficult for them to establish their own individuality and their place in a community. Okay, I invited you to look at the kids' faces and try to figure out what the emotions were. There is research that suggests we are far worse at judging emotion in the faces of people outside of our own racial group. So you may read the face of someone outside of your racial group as being angry or sad or sneaky or suspicious more often than you will a person within your own racial group. And that comes from being in a community and learning faces, learning facial shapes. We can also distinguish between members of our own group easier than we can out groups. Again, the brain learns how to sort, distinguish, and form patterns based on repeated interactions. And so as a consequence of living in largely segregated communities, we are not very good at judging the emotional state of a person outside of our racial group, and we are not as good at distinguishing between members of a different racial group as we are with our own. Okay, so, and we'll have to move a little bit quickly. I apologize because we're a little short on time, but Agata believes she saw Daquan with crumbs on his shirt. Okay, so now we have more information. You should, 1, search Daquan's backpack. 2, ask Daquan's mother to search for the cookies. 3, offer Daquan additional sweets to take home. 4, tell Daquan a story about how you once stole something. Or 5, do nothing. Okay, so we'll run a poll on that one as well. Stephanie, if you can put that one up.
I can't find it. I'm sorry. I did it, but it's not letting me. Oh, let me see. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I found it.
No worries.
Here we go.
Okay, so someone mentioned that, oh God, you know, I just want to avoid the conflict. I'm just going to ask the parent who, from my perspective, my prior experiences might be a little easier to work with and I'd work my way through. Another person asked, is by asking all of them just kind of avoiding the problem or expressing a different kind of bias. So let's talk a little bit about the decision-making in this instance and how it affects parent relationships. And I'm going to be a little quicker on this poll. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds just so we can ensure that we can move through and cover all of our topics. Okay, so we have a lot of people who are just, poor Ada is going to keep crying and just not enjoy her birthday party because they are not going to go in the backpack or talk to Daquan or offer additional sweets to take home or ask his mother to search for the cookies. Most of us are in the category of do nothing. We're almost hitting the point we did last time. I'm going to stop at around 70 or so votes because I think that's what we got last time. Okay, great. So why don't we close the poll here? Okay, so 62% said do nothing. By doing nothing, right, that doesn't mean that these stereotypes or implicit bias are not operating. Instead, what this example was intended to show was the way in which microaggressions can show up. So for people who think that Daquan is guilty, he had the crumbs on his shirt, right? How are they going to engage with Daquan's mother? Do they go to her and speak directly? What associations are they making? What assumptions are they making about this interaction with his mother? And how much are they willing to sort of interact with her, right, as an equal and have these conversations? One of the ways in which bias shows up is an inability or an unwillingness, right, to engage in those face-to-face conversations and those honest relationships between parents that would normally occur. So for people who engage in a strategy of avoidance, right, talking to his mother, that's another way in which implicit bias can show up, and right, it becomes a form of microaggression. That's our second term for the day. Okay, what are microaggressions?
Well, here's the microaggressions.
Can you pay attention to that? Because that's something I would like to learn more about. Because I'm sure I do it all the time.
Oh, that's okay. All right, so
no eating while you're walking around. Stop now.
What is that new problem?
So we're just going to keep going. One thing I wanted to raise for you was this question of childhood innocence or bias. Okay, now I want us to sort of bracket for a moment the young person that spoke up during our call, because that was a very brave thing to do in this conversation, and I don't want there to be an overemphasis on that child's comments. What I will say to you is that there's this way in which adults think that children do not see race, right? And that is fundamentally incorrect. And if you have any doubts about that, I invite you to go and read Erin Winkler's article, Children Are Not Colorblind. She talks about the ways infants' eyes can be tracked to show that they have already developed a preference for people in their own racial group. That's an assumption based on single race families, so that's limited in some regard, okay? But they have already learned to tell the difference between racial groups, and to some extent, they are showing preferences by as early as age 2 for one racial group over another. They use racial heuristics in their thinking. And parents are often naive to how this is operating. Also, they tend to think that they're doing their children a favor by not talking to them about racial topics. And so what children learn instead is not to not use race. They learn to not tell their parents when they're using race. And children end up getting their information about race from the places that you would least want them to, which is random references in the world, right? The realm of implicit bias. So by declining to talk to your child about race, by pretending your child is not using racial heuristics, you're actually leaving your child vulnerable to a lot of racist imagery, racist messaging that's in society, and they have no one to talk to about it except their peers. If you see children sort of naturally gravitating into single race playgroups, if you see them sort of naturally accusing certain children of, right, disciplinary problems or more aggression, those children are picking things up from the society around them that tell them to attach particular messages, particular ideas, particular associations with groups, and they're spitting them out and trying them out in the early years. And when you do nothing to engage in conversations or dialogue with them about that process, by the time they get to the age of 7 and 9, they know they're not supposed to talk to you about it, and so they will start to do something we call aversive racism, which is they use neutral justifications to hide bias. So they'll say, we just don't play with Sally because she doesn't like soccer, when there may be a racial calculus in their thinking that they know they're not supposed to discuss. They're also picking up their messages about race from your behavior. So if you have primarily a single race friendship group, they know we don't really associate with those people. They take that onto the playground. If you don't speak to the parents outside of your racial group very frequently, they know they don't have to treat people from outside of their group with the same level of respect, or they can express discomfort with them, and that's seemingly right and okay and normal way of interacting cross-racially. Children pay a lot of attention to what you do. They listen to what you say, and it's important to have the conversations, but they pay a lot of attention to what you do. And so both of those things have to match up in order for you to end up with a result that you're hoping for in terms of an anti-discriminatory perspective. Okay, so that's autopilot on the playground. For those of you that are interested in the scholarly side of this, the Yale Child Study Center did a study of this, and it actually plays out even with teachers. So preschool teachers, when they were told, watch this cross-racial scenario, there's gonna be a disciplinary problem, just watch the kids interact, see if you can find it. They tracked the teacher's eyeballs, and once they were told there was going to be a discrimination problem, the teacher's eyes, 42% of them, went to the Black boys in the room. That helps explain Daquan's prior suspension. Is that lots of kids will act out, right? But because implicit bias trains us to look particular places for particular things, some folks get noticed more than others, and that has consequences. Okay, so let's say you did try to have this chat with Daquan's mother. We want to go back to some of the examples that I suggested. Searching his backpack. Again, what's a microaggression? It's this way in which someone engages in a pattern of behavior that either expresses a stereotype or aversion or avoidance of a particular group. Okay, no one wanted to search the backpack. I'm really glad about that. It's a particularly bad move, okay? Because it both violates, right, his sort of sense of privacy and dignity and the entire family's sense of privacy and dignity. But that would be a microaggression, right? A small, like sort of slight, oh, well, I was just gonna search maybe everybody's backpack and I started with him. There are ways in which we sort of justify this kind of behavior that is, right, disrespectful, but we'll characterize it as a small or minor incursion. Again, asking his mother to search for the cookies is pretty well established then that you think that he is a source of suspicion, and she will, right, experience that as a microaggression if she is encountering at the school a continuing pattern of people being suspicious of her child. So one of the things to understand about microaggressions is the one interaction that you are involved in may seem like a teeny tiny little thing. But if it's part of a pattern of a child being regarded in a particular way, or a family being regarded in a particular way, that is when it starts to become part of a series of microaggressions, and you will get a much larger reaction to what you see as a small, minor mistake, because it's the 40th time it's happened in the past 35 days. Offer Daquan additional sweets to take home. Again, messaging about stereotyping. So for some people, they made the quick jump to the overworked, harried mother and the kid who doesn't know his dad to poverty. They went quickly to that place. Again, Daquan's mother is going to experience this as a microaggression because why do they think her kid doesn't have sweets at home? Why is he being offered food and no other child? Okay, expression of stereotype. Tell Daquan a story about how you once stole something. Again, you're accusing him of something. It's friendly and it's nice, right? And it tries to invite you into the circle of people who do bad things, but it's still a microaggression, right? Because you are categorizing him as a person who's worthy of suspicion, and even basically at some level calling him a thief and inviting him, right, through this relationship of intimacy to reveal something that in fact he may have no participation in. Okay, so what can we do about all this? And I apologize, we only have 5 minutes left, so there won't be much time for discussion. But again, it's understanding what these things are, what microaggressions are, and how they're related to implicit bias. So microaggressions are the little teeny tiny ways that seem safe, that we express stereotypes, or we express aversion, or express avoidance. This can happen sometimes for very progressive people because they're so worried about making a mistake and so worried about saying the wrong thing that they avoid people of color. They avoid eye contact, they avoid conversations, they avoid connection. That is another way, right, of expressing this kind of aversion or discomfort and can be experienced as a microaggression. So talking to Daquan's mother about the child being upset and you didn't know what to do and gosh, this is overwhelming and we've all been in this place, right, is a different way of relating to her than saying, can I search your child's backpack for cookies? Microaggressions may seem like isolated annoyances, but over time, they have cumulative effects. Okay, again, unconscious bias, we're illustrating it in this particular context with race, but it can happen with any marginalized group. There are some unconscious associations. They were conscious at one point, they recede into the unconscious. They cause you to make prejudgments, they affect behavior, and that results in this pattern of discrimination. I'll leave you with the question of who programmed your autopilot and to think more critically about it as you move through the world. So some of you may remember Dove's ad campaign last year for Summer Glow Lotion and the way it described for normal to dark skin, what's normal skin? In their mind, normal skin was not dark. This is a product that was out last year. Again, you glide right through the drugstore. You're not consciously thinking about what Dove has said on its product. You may even purchase this without even thinking of it. Someone is programming your autopilot. That's not your fault. right? But it's your responsibility to understand what's happening and the quiet ways this can seep in. Another way people think implicit bias is being established right now and stereotyping is through the use of GIFs. So all those little cute things and those little memes that people send around, a lot of them contain racial stereotypes. A lot of them contain racial caricatures. So take a look at what's appearing on your phone as a joke, because there are ways in which, right, stereotypes and bias are being manufactured even now. And then pay close attention to educational materials. So this one, probably a lot of people caught this one, but which picture is associated with happy and proud, okay, the white students, who's angry, the young Black girl, who's sad, right, the young Black boy. So negative emotions, right, less desired states associated with Blackness in an exercise where you're just supposed to be practicing your handwriting. Okay, so your kids may end up consuming this information. They don't know their autopilot is being programmed. And when this gets played out on the program, on the playground, you say, where in the heck did this come from? This isn't how we do things in our house. But there are all these different places, right, that your child is drawing racial information from. And that's why it's so important for you to have these dialogues and sometimes uncomfortable conversations, because children will say things in terms that are often quite stark and dramatic and maybe even seem really troubling. But it's the child's way of sort of processing and figuring out his, her, or their space in the world. And they need you as a partner in that, even when the things that they say seem uncomfortable, because the best remedy for that is to have an honest conversation and talk about your values rather than leaving them in silence and confusion. Okay, so I'll leave you with this slide. It's just another way of talking about this, saying, again, a conscious bias is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. What can you do? You can practice empathy. As you look through the slides later on, you'll see the different steps that you can take, right? Know your biases well, recognize they exist. Think critically, always ask yourself, what if, why, how can I challenge this particular approach? And as long as you're challenging your assumptions and your traditions, and really trying to shift perspective and take perspective of someone in the position, right, of who you might be targeting, you'll do much better at disrupting these undercurrents in society and doing your part to dismantle this form of bias. But again, it's a constant process. You will continue to return to these things again and again, because that whole expression is of being woke. Being woke is about staying woke. It's not actually a state you reach of like perfection where you know everything and you understand everything and you're progressive. It's a struggle to constantly acquire new information, assess your information, assess how you're operating, and make responsible decisions for you, for your family, and for your children. So I hope you found this helpful today. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but I think we covered a lot of things, and hopefully there's a lot for you to think about in the days ahead.
Thanks, Camille. Do we have time for a few questions, Camille?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know if someone wants to ask a question on anything that Camille has covered, or the exercises, or if you would like to put a question in the chat, I'm happy to relay that. I mean, fabulous as always, Camille. A big thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I did have one quick question. Can you guys hear me? I wasn't sure if my mic is on or off.
Yes, who's speaking? I don't see a square lit up for a name.
All right, I'll turn on my video. Well, it looks like I can. It's not in my settings here. Stand by. Hold on a second.
And again, I was just looking for a name. I don't necessarily need to see you. I just.
My name is Ben. I have a daughter in 4th grade West Valley campus. My question is, is there any evidence, or do you have any metrics that shows that implicit bias or unconscious bias has an actual measured effect on people's actions? I mean, even something to the effect of where it could be used, let's say, in a courtroom or a court of law. Is there evidence widespread where, you know, maybe a Black hiring manager who maybe unconsciously has, bad experiences and does not think well of, let's say, a different race, and would not hire, let's say, a person from a Caucasian person who may be well qualified. Is there any evidence or any studies that have been done that actually show this measured response?
Sure. So there's a couple of different ways to answer your question. The simplest way to answer it is to suggest you go to the Harvard Implicit Bias website and take a look at the statistics that they have collected over the past, I would say, 10 to 20 years. For people who have come to the site and taken their tests that have these sort of grids that show the association, whether or not people are able to make these quick associations between positive attributes and marginalized groups. That will not entirely satisfy your question, because you want sort of empirical data from real life situations where people have used implicit bias to subordinate particular folks. So instead, I would draw your attention to the social psychology literature, and there's about, I would say, 15 or 20 studies in the area showing different ways in which implicit bias plays out in employment settings. One way in which it plays out is with regard to names. The most recent study, I think this was maybe 2007 when the very first one was done, on quote unquote black sounding names and responses to employment ads. And so when people with identical resumes were sending out their resumes, one group with the name Lakeisha or Jamal, the other with Mary or Joe, there were 50% more callbacks for people with the identical resumes based on the name. That was the only difference between the two employment files, the name. So that's an example of where implicit bias plays out in the real world that has actual material and economic effects. They then ran the same survey using names that were African associated as opposed to sort of Black working class names. The African names were preferred over the Black working class American names. There have been various iterations of that study. The most recent one was in 2019. There are other ones that involve memos that are sent out with different names attached to them. And when the memos are sent out from white represented employees versus Black represented employees, the same memos will be sent back with identified grammatical errors, challenges to the factual assertions in the memos. They come back with far more corrections, the exact same memo, the only change was the name. Again, right, ample evidence to demonstrate that implicit bias actually does play a role in the workplace. We could talk about other studies with regard to skin color that show differences in terms of compensation awarded, but I think you get my point, is that the evidence is well established.
So has there been any cases where, let's say, implicit bias was used from a lawsuit of a person not getting a position based on equal opportunity laws in, let's say, the state of California?
And why is that relevant to our conversation today?
Well, just because implicit bias and unconscious bias has, relevance to behavior and action. So I guess some people would basically be more attuned to wanting to know how that implicit or unconscious bias actually relates to action or behavior. So,
I completely understand. I guess my point to you is really as a lawyer who kind of knows the game that people play with expert witnesses and challenges around particular approaches to research or to evidentiary questions. I think the question of whether or not the material that was presented survived a motion to dismiss or a motion to summary judgment when offered in support of a pleading is less relevant to whether or not it actually exists in the real world, as opposed to whether or not it's suited for some sort of legal adjudication. Do you see my point?
I do. I guess me just personally, I'm more interested in people's behaviors and action than what's kind of going on in their unconscious brain. So that's my ordeal with trying to reconcile this whole event.
Well, so here's the challenge: is that we live in a society, which I think that this norm is actually changing, right? But we live in a society in which explicit expression of bias has been disfavored. Okay, and there are all sorts of consequences that you suffer as a consequence of that explicit expression. So what we're learning to do is find other ways to express that bias. So if you don't like implicit bias and you don't like microaggressions, you would probably be more comfortable with the theory of aversive discrimination, which says people actually do, right, have racial preferences and racial feelings that they will acknowledge. But the only way that they will articulate this is if they can find an objective and neutral practice to justify their behavior. So there are some interesting studies about the Obama effect, where progressive folks who voted for Obama were then given an opportunity to make a discriminatory decision, and they actually were more inclined to make that discriminatory decision because they felt they had cover from their prior progressive decision. So those are studies that actually deal more with, right, discriminatory attitudes that are right at the surface that we choose to articulate and explain in other ways. For other people, this is a lot more varied. And when you talk about child development and the messages that we send our children, I think we are increasingly not going to find children who explicitly express bias in these terms. Again, I'm bracketing the entire political moment we are currently in, which raises some real disturbing issues. But if we bracket that for a moment and sort of understand, right, diversity conversations in this country as proceeding in a particular way, most of our children have been socialized to know that it is morally wrong to articulate these things in this way, even as they see a society organized in a fundamentally different way. And so how do they make sense of that? And how do they explain that to us? They use the exact same terms that we're using, where we sort of ignore Grandpa Joe at Thanksgiving dinner, who says all sorts of things, right, that we don't think people should say anymore. But the family tolerates this, and the child observing that behavior then understands that actually some people in our family believe this, we just don't talk about it. Or we certainly don't challenge people who think this. And then we all proceed through the uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner, but the child has learned a lesson from that interaction, which is not one often that their parents intend. I want to give other people a chance to weigh in who had questions.
And like I said, just from your perspective, I mean, I can say as someone who's African-American, the number of times someone will make an assumption about my upbringing, what I have, what I don't have, or being in a conversation with a group of people, and if as the Black person, literally just ignoring me, not acknowledging me. It's like I'm not there, making an assumption that, you know, I must have come on welfare or I got a job based upon affirmative action. So, you know, if you talk about the workplace, I mean, these are comments frequently. I mean, I just actually left a job based upon the decision that it was driving me nuts that the people thought like any Black action that happened, it was okay to ask me questions and inquire like, well, why do they steal? Why do they loot? And for me, in my mind, I'm thinking we live in California. How can you not know that these conversations are not appropriate and not understand the implicit bias in the question that you're asking me? But like I said, it was one of these things where I understood that the person, you know, didn't mean to, you know, I was, you know, I'm old enough that I can unpack what was being said and understand that racism wasn't intent, but from their perspective, from what they knew of Black people, from the news, what have you, this was the assumption of who I was or who I must be. And like I said, the thing that was frustrating to the point that she's mentioning is like, even though the person knew like I'd gone to college, knew like certain details, they still could not separate these stereotypes that they had about Black people when I met none of those stereotypes that they would be discussing to me. Because that was the perspective of what it meant to be Black.
And I mean, I can totally relate. And I think it's one of the reasons I got interested in this work. When I first started working with Michael and Juliet, I told them the story about my experiences being bused from my working class Black community to a white community. And the first day I got there, they gave me a reading assessment test. And I remember sitting next to my new teacher who looked like Mrs. Santa, and she smelled like cookies. She was fabulous, right? And as I went through the reading test and got more and more of the words right, I watched her hands start to shake and how excited she got at the fact that I was, right, disrupting a stereotype in her mind that I was actually smart. And she was so happy for me, and she grabbed my hand and ran down the hallway yelling, "We made a mistake. She's smart. She's smart." I remember that now, and I'm 50. And so it's why I want to impress upon you the importance of talking about race with your kids and supporting Leela in this journey about diversity, equity, and inclusion, where they are so motivated and so leading into these questions and inviting you to take this journey with them, is that these things have lasting effects. Luckily for me, that was a huge motivator. But it also showed me, right, that the world was a challenging place. My daughter had a similar experience, you know, right, years and years later. She scored extremely well on her reading test in South Pasadena, and the teacher gave her a little toy ape as her prize, monkey. So
And
there's ways in which these things continue.
And just to add to you guys, so I'm French. I am living in the US for 1 year, and we joined the US because we thought really deeply that US is really, you know, open on the world, and we want to give our child a vision of the US because they are more open maybe than us. And the first thing that I was quite shocked as stranger, you know, is that when you arrive and when you do your social security number and everything, they ask you, you know, they ask you white, Hispanic, black, and I was shocked about that. So I don't know if someone can share also that, but I think it was the first impression that I have, just to understand why in the US we have to highlight that, because at the end I'm just, you know, my age, my gender, my, you know, and for me being French, having to write white, black, Asian, and I was quite shocked.
So it is a different orientation here. I think for folks of color in France, that process of not naming is actually something that is sort of a way of not giving full credit to what's happening to them in terms of racial dynamics. So the counting here in the US, at least in the form you filled out, is an attempt to monitor and watch and sort of try to track these patterns of discrimination and have the data. So you notice that the other questioner, right, wants data. Some people really want data before they will agree that we should take action for something. So for those folks, the failure to collect data, the failure to ask those questions creates real challenges in motivating folks to actually support change. But for folks who have not engaged that system before, it is like pretty traumatic, right, to think that this information is being gathered. But a lot of the questions around social justice, at least with regard to race, are going to require that kind of counting and that kind of data collection, both to, right, address skepticism and also to think about the distribution of resources.
Hey so Camille. Oh, sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, thinking about what you were just saying about the, it ties into what Ben was asking about, sort of empirical data, and what you just talked about as far as data collection. You know, my wife and I just moved here from New York, and we sold a house, or we were trying to sell a house back in a fairly nice suburb in New York. And she kept asking, my wife kept asking, why are these prices coming in so far below what I know the house is worth? And, you know, just a couple of months ago, a report came out in the New York Times that said Black homeowners, you know, get lower appraisals than people of, you know, than white homeowners in the same comparable neighborhoods. And that's been a way to sort of skirt around like redlining, which was a practice that was done by banks to keep Blacks out of certain neighborhoods. And it's something that, you know, you have to deal with as a Black person, whereas the, you know, the white neighbors or people in the neighborhood that aren't involved in those practices don't even know about, but sort of benefit from in a certain way. So that's one avenue you might want to take a look at to see, you know, where do those things play out. I guess my question was, when you talk about children and engaging them in race, are these questions, because my daughter's already come to me and she's asked us numerous times about, you know, things about race, like, you know, she said, like, why am I Black and all my friends are not, you know, as a sort of, she's noticing these things. And do you recommend that when we have these conversations with her, that she should also engage with her peers? Or is that something that you deal with in the home? Or, you know, how do you, because I imagine these conversations have to be going on within her peer group. So should we be asking about that proactively, or do you kind of wait till the child brings it to you?
I think, so you know your child well. It sounds like she is already coming to you with these questions. I think that's so great. It shows that you've created an environment where she knows it's safe to have these conversations. My view is both, is to proactively ask and, right, wait for the questions to come up. One of the ways that you ensure that your child knows that he or she can come to you, and we're getting into a session that we were actually going to hold later about how to talk to your child about race. But in some way, you've had these conversations with your kids on other topics where you sort of have to bring things up a couple of times before they'll actually talk to you about them. It's the same sort of thing with race, is that you ask a question and they'll say, no, nothing. And then you say, okay. And then you ask maybe another time, a couple of weeks later or a month later, and they say, no, nothing. And then the third time they come in their own and they just tell you, they know you're comfortable. Or you share with them, right, your thoughts. So there are all these, you know, incredibly stressful political events happening around us. Our kids know we're stressed. They can see that we're worried about these things. They're catching snippets of the news. Some of these conversations would be happening on the playground if it weren't for COVID. You would be surprised at what they know and the sort of half of what they know and the sort of disjointed or distorted understanding they have of some things, because they're overhearing the newscast as you think you're turning it off, or they're reading the newspaper, right, sitting on the table and reading it quickly before it's taken away. Or a friend has told them some version, right, of what is going on in the world. And they're also on the internet looking for information occasionally or bumping into information. It's better for them to know they can come to you and ask these questions about what's happening. My daughter and I did a series of sort of math examples in the car the other day to try to figure out, like, how many cases had Ruth Bader Ginsburg heard on the court? Because she said to me, who's RBG? What's all that about? Why is everybody so, you know, so upset about that? And so we had a conversation about gender equality and about her role on the court. And then we did some math around, like, how many cases she had actually heard. It doesn't always have to be this kind of fraught, you know, overwhelming conversation, because if you have the conversations in little bite-sized chunks and they're layered over time, one, sometimes they're not going to go exactly right, and your kid will come back with a version where you're like, oh my God, you know, that's not what I said at all. How did they get that from what I said? Then you can correct, because you keep having the conversations and you keep layering and you keep helping them to develop their understanding, and they test that understanding around what's happening right around them. And that's how the dialogue starts. Here is the danger, particularly if you have a child that is likely to experience discrimination, is if you don't talk to your child about race, they will be experiencing racial dynamics and have no one to talk to, or they won't know exactly what's happening to them, and they'll create all sorts of meanings around it, right, that are destructive and unhelpful. So you want to keep the door open so that when they have these confusing interactions, my daughter came to me with her little plastic toy and said, you know, she gave this to me after I scored the highest score on the test. And we had a limited discussion about it. One, because I was hurt and I didn't want to transfer that onto her, but we've revisited it over time. And I've made it an open situation where she can come back and talk to me about it, because even her understanding and her feeling about it may change over time. For some kids, it's quick. I can tell you, when my teacher ran down the hallway screaming, you know, we made a mistake, she's smart, she's smart. And she might not have even been that loud. It's just reverberating in my little tiny kid brain. Is that I knew immediately, because I had been bused from a working class neighborhood, and I kind of knew what the stereotypes were going to be about me. So for me, it was very quick. She's grown up in a much more privileged context, and so her journey and sort of these understandings is going to be different.
Thanks. Yeah, I was most concerned about pushing it, because as you noted, like when she brought it to me and I started to talk to her about it, she's, you know, after a while, if I asked her questions, she's like, oh, I didn't mean anything by it. I don't, you know, and she kind of shied away from the topic. So I didn't want to try to over engage or force engagement when it was beyond her comfort zone.
It's sort of like the birds and the bees kind of thing, where you talk to them a little bit and they're like, okay, enough. But maybe they'll come back with a question and you want them to come back with a really important question. So it's okay if you get waved off, just so they know that you're there and you can talk about it. And maybe even that you're struggling with some things. And maybe even they'll point out that, why do you do that, mom or dad? And that might make you feel uncomfortable, right? And trigger some uncomfortable conversations. But that is part of the process. That's part of the journey.
I'm a parent of 2 Black children at Leela, and one of them is in 7th grade. And I will say, I think it's really important important for us to make sure they know they can talk to us, because like and I've had a lot of these conversations with my daughter pretty much since she started asking questions around age 6. But in 4th grade, they read a book it was basically about an African-American family in the South during Reconstruction, and the little boy in the story sees his dad essentially get lynched. And it was a 4th grade reading. And she was like pretty traumatized by it, but I think didn't have words for that and didn't know how to talk about it. And because I wasn't notified that that was in the curriculum, I didn't know to ask her, like, you know, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? What are you reading about? But I think that's where it really does have to be a joint partnership, where the school has to let us know what are these conversations that are happening in class. And then we need to be checking in with our kids about what they're learning, what they're talking about, what they're experiencing. I mean, Martin Luther King Day is like a constant trigger, where it's like the one day we talk about, you know, Blackness systematically, and the message is Black people get shot for doing good things. And I've seen so many kids get traumatized by the way that we handle that. So I think it's just so important for us to create that open door for our kids, but also for the school to be in communication with us about, you know, what they're discussing in the classroom, so we can support our kids. She was the only African-American kid in the class in 4th grade. So she really didn't know where to go, who to talk to.
I think that's why it's so encouraging to see so many people at this event. And you know, you've stuck, I mean, God, we're half an hour past when we were supposed to end, and you're all still here. And so I just want to thank you for that. And for, again, the interest in the conversations, the interest in what the school is doing, the interest in continuing this conversation, and the coordination. I think Valerie is absolutely right, is that you need that kind of partnership between parents and the school, an understanding of what the curriculum includes, what it might include, what supports might be necessary at various points, what your counseling feature looks like in terms of cultural sensitivity and inclusion, right? All of these things are part of the process. And as you, as the school engages in this, you know, diversity strategic planning process, thinking about the diversity statement, all of these areas in which you're working, it's critically important to have that parent input and that parent support, and to, you know, host events of this kind where we can all, you know, grow in our understanding together. Again, the shared vocabulary, the shared understanding of where we're headed, really engaging with people's potential concerns and having an open and honest conversation. But I think, Michael, this is a sign that you were right. We do need another session.
Yeah, look, you know, Valerie, thanks for all your comments. We're grateful to you because we know that you're really trying to help us, as is the case with a number of parents. You're really trying to help us forge out the right type of partnership. And just this afternoon, we were working with Camille and the leadership team, looking at our curriculum review. We know we've got masses of work to do, but obviously the choice of texts, the choice of pedagogy around those texts, and then setting up the safe space and the language where students can be asking all of those probing questions and talking about whether they're comfortable or uncomfortable. These are messy and hard conversations, and the more we go into this space, the more we're reminded of exactly that. But the messier and the harder they become, the more fervent our commitment, I believe, to continue to have the conversations. We owe it to our students because we're going to be letting them out into the world tomorrow. And we owe it to them to be going into the world with a vocabulary and an ability to talk in this space. Camille, as always, I say thank you. We are always humbled. You know, every time you tell that anecdote about the principal who who was assessing your test, I'm reminded of the importance of this work. But we're also shaking, Camille, but we're shaking because we got it right. And we're so grateful that you are helping us in this space. And I'm also very grateful to the parents. I know there's a whole lot of passion in our community, and you know, our ongoing commitment is real. And now that extends to the creation of a board subcommittee on diversity, which will have parental representation. and which is going to be overseen, it is currently being overseen by Chantal Dapuzzo, board member, trustee, and parent at Pasadena. So thank you, a very big thank you to everyone. And if I can finish by saying, yes, indeed, we've invited Camille to a follow-up question, which is a session to help us with the question that many of you have been asking our school community, and that is, how do I talk to my child about race? So that's where we're going. But thank you for an incredible, incisive and eye-opening foray into the world of bias. And thanks again, everyone, and thank you, Camille.
Always glad to join you. Thank you again. I really enjoyed it.
It's a privilege. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Leela.
Good night.
Good night.